Hey everybody, welcome to 3D6 Charge, a podcast about competitive Warhammer 40k, the state of the game and community news. We're streaming at Twitch/3D6 Charge every Monday night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, where you can follow and sub. We're also whenever you can find pods such as Spotify and iTunes. This is episode 56, List Building Philosophy. I am Corso, and joining me tonight is Kevin Lieb. Kevin, you're muted.
Howdy, howdy.
There we go. And Benjamin Rubenstein.
Hey everyone.
Hey, so Benjamin and I went to an RTT over the past weekend, so figured we'll chat about that a little bit, and then we'll use that to segue into overall list building philosophies, and I think this is a pretty good topic, especially if you're trying to like gear up to go to like a GT, because I think like the RTT that's where you can get like a lot of your rapid fire testing in for a overall list concept, and on a side note, probably build up your immune system a little bit, because I feel like every time I go to an RTT or a GT, like I get like the Con Crud or like the Pax Pox or like just like a lesser version of it, commensurate to how long the event actually was. Like the day after on Sunday, I think I slept for like 15 hours, and then woke up still tired, and then I basically took like a half day off today for just not feeling well. But yeah, Ben, how was your RTT experience?
I mean, it was pretty good. I did the classic 2-1 with my Tau list, which is pretty normal record for that list. Because it's just a couple like unwinnables, like either I catch a mission that's really bad or a matchup that's really bad and I lose that one, and find it fairly easy to win the rest out. Not too interested in talking about my list or like my games that much. It's, we've all heard how my Tau list function at this point a bunch, and I don't think that it's so different from like how the rest of the meta is trying to play. I don't think it's like super worth talking about unless you're also attempting to do well with Tau. So but I did have fun. It was a good time. And I believe that this score is going to put me in top 10 Tau, if not the top 5, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I like about the way that ITC does their rankings. If you're not in contention for like absolute best in the world, you can still break it down by faction and region, and gun for that.
Yeah. Tau rocking the like 35-37% win rate means that like going 2-1 in a bunch of RTTs just like puts you in contention for like top 10 Tau, which is kind of wild because it's just not a very or it is a competitive track because the army is struggling so much. You have to records that don't look very impressive are fairly challenging to obtain with that army. So it feels weird being like, oh yeah, I went 2-1 in a bunch of RTTs, so I'm like in the top 10. But yeah, how'd yours go, Chris?
I mean, I had a great time at the event. The venue was the first time holding a Warhammer event, and I have to say that in terms of like the physical space available for the event, it was great. Every table you could walk around 360 degrees, which is a rarity, and once you do that for an event, I don't feel like I can go back, but I mean, I know I will. To just being elbow to elbow with everybody. But I'll definitely be going back there just because one, you can go around 360 degrees around every table, and then two, there's a cafe there. Well, and while the selection is fairly limited, they do bring your order to the table, which is nice.
There were actually 2 tables you couldn't walk around, and I played on both of them. But that being said, the place was excellent. There was so much space, really nice environment, air conditioned, of course, which is like A+.
I know you guys had some concern about the terrain before the event started. Did that pan out? Were those fears realized?
I don't want to harp too much on terrain because I feel like every event, like even like marquee events, like terrain's always like a perpetual issue. Um, and it's just one of those things where like every table having perfect terrain is basically a pipe dream. Obviously, some events, they're going to be more planet bowling balls than others, but I mean, I think the TO Jack McKay, he did an all right job at working with what he had. I know like places don't have infinite resources or space to just store terrain, but I think for the most part it worked out. You know, okay. I didn't hear too much griping aside from like one or two like booger tables, but that happens at every event. So.
Yeah, there were. I think I want to say there were two tables that were disasters. But a couple people dropped, so we didn't have to play on those tables. We just actually rotated those tables out, and no one played on them. So I felt like the rest of the tables were like pretty decent.
Yeah. Um, the
Um,
only table that aside from like the one egregious like green bowling ball table.
Yeah, it had like a hill and a tree in the middle, and that was it. It's like, oh
Yeah,
no.
it was a great Warhammer fantasy table.
Yes. In
Um,
fact, people ended up playing AOS on it by the end of the event because
yeah, they
literally
did actually
all
play
the 40K
AOS.
guys were like, this is an extra free table that no one's playing because of drops. We're just not using the table.
The only other table that I had like a huge issue with, it wasn't so much like a terrain issue as it was like it was the that kind of table that I think like GW used to sell where like you get like the molded plastic like squares and there's like undulations and stuff and like the hills and it looks really cool, but it's a fucking nightmare to play on. Um, that's my only real gripe of it, terrain wise. And then in terms of the rest of the event, I mean, I think it ran pretty smoothly. There was one situation where chess clocks would have been great, but you know,
Yeah, last round ran a couple bit over. Actually, both rounds 2 and 3 ran pretty far over, but it's hard to enforce that, especially like a newer TO, where it's just like, what do you do? Because it's not clear who's at fault. Like just walking up to the table, being like, "Hey, you guys are like on turn 3, and like and the round's over." Um, so
yeah.
yeah,
And
I don't
then
know. This
like,
is why I
what
just
do
think
you?
every event from the smallest RTT to the biggest GT is just like chess clocks for every table. It fixes all of those problems, and
if
I don't
you're
even.
if you're
Sorry, go
air
ahead.
quotes competitive, you should have a
Yeah.
chess clock.
I was actually upset I
Honestly,
forgot my chess
even
clock.
even casual events, because like casual, like make the points limits lower, make the rounds longer, so that the chess clock's not an issue for like people actually finishing games. But like I don't know, it's like one of the worst experiences ever to be like, oh, I'm like kind of new to 40K, and I went to a casual event. And my opponent was newer and took 2 hours for their first turn, and then it was just like, okay, well, uh, I'll move these models. No one scores primary because you don't get to turn 2, and then the game's over. Like I don't know. I just feel like chess clocks fix so many problems at so many levels.
There is, but I mean, there's also like if you're a newer TO and you're not like an established like venue or circuit, like it can be a big ask to like, yeah, you got to provide like all this terrain, all of these mats, even just like all of these like tables. Oh, and then also you got to spend like 15 to 20 bucks a table for a chess clock if you want to ensure that every table has one.
Yeah. So when you bring up the terrain part of it and needing to get some, the awkward part about what was kind of decided how we were handling the bases of terrain has kind of led to an issue where some terrain that would be good just can't be used at certain angles. Like you think of an L, like a Nova L without a base on it is like the perfect obscuring piece of terrain. Like you get to, are you touching it? No, otherwise you're obscuring. Fantastic. And this solves a lot of the problems I've felt with 9th edition where obscuring is better than old GW rules for protect your models, but still, like, if you're like, for instance, chicken walkers or raiders or any breathable speed, it, the traditional obscuring rules with a box just kind of means your models are just going to get hit and you really can't play around it. Um, but because we decided to have bases matter, which it felt like the right decision. And now that I'm looking at how the game has kind of come out, turned out, I feel like the more and more I look at like counting the base, kind of makes some terrain like from great to bad. Because if you take an L and put it on a triangle base, you've just made it so that a Jakari can just like sneak. The amount of Jakari or anything has to sneak around is infinitely less. And even worse, if you put it on a box, like a square piece, now
That just doesn't do anything.
it doesn't do anything. Now
Assuming
that
it has
being,
holes in it, right?
yeah, well, not even holes. Like if you have like a triangle and you make it a box as the base, well, your guys like they have to be all the way back here. It's very easy to get around that angle. Very easy to get around that
Well,
angle.
I mean, the actual L has like windows or something, so like you can see through it physically. Because if it's like
Right.
a true wall, then it doesn't matter.
Correct.
Which is wild because now GW is releasing these packets and they're like, oh, we do mean like solid walls with no windows. And it's like, but that's not the terrain you sell. And that's not the terrain that people play on because that's not the terrain that you sell. So it's
Right.
like, they're almost like, oh, just go back to like first floor block line of sight. Well, like, that's not the rules you wrote officially.
Yeah. If we get the usual kind of like December mini FAQ, I kind of want them to just throw that rule in. And even if I have to wait for a chapter proof just to make it official, I'm fine with that. If they do the old we're beta ruling it, but reality is our beta rules are our official rules, I'd love it. I'd be so
Yeah,
happy.
because the reality is, if you want to hide your models, and if you're hiding your models behind a building, well, a building's a square, and anywhere in that square, you're not actually hidden. So you have to be behind the square. Well, that building can't be on an objective because that's what the rules say. So it's probably like a good 3 inches away from the objective, and then it's probably 6 inches wide, and then you can't be touching it. So your infantry are like 9 inches from that objective, maybe, which means you're probably advancing to get onto it, and then like that's your turn if you're hiding them. You put them in the building, well, they can be seen and they just get murdered by all the shooting nonsense that's in the game. Um, and then meanwhile, what are our best armies in the game, right? Admech and Drakari. Well, Admech chicken walkers can move 16 inches before they shoot, so they can start behind a building and then just hit you because they can go literally wherever they want and just like peek behind the corner that you're hiding behind and hit you.
And then
And
they can
then
deep strike shunt move their infantry.
Yep. Their infantry deep strike shunt move. They also advance and shoot. So like their infantry can just like go, 11 plus inches and still just shoot you. Like they can point at a blob, give them plus 3 inches of movement, and just like send them at you. Um, like Vanguard, like especially with the new Skachari cohort, Vanguard advance on 2d6, pick the highest. You can just and then you can give them plus 3 inches on their move and ignore the path to their armor wave. And like all of a sudden that unit's like moving like 14, 15 inches before it shoots. And like so, and then the same thing with Drakari, right? They're putting guys in raiders. Those raiders go 14 plus inches, fly. They're peeking. They're also really long, so they're peeking around corners, and at the same time, they can be deployed way behind stuff in fairly safe locations that other people can't get to. So it's really just like fast units that can move really far and shoot are just insane, and everyone else is heinously punished by these rules because you have to sit in the building, which like doesn't actually do anything. You get +1 on your saves, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think
but
that compounds the whole like TO issue of what do you do about uh, terrain? Because if you invest too much in like in one certain style of terrain, well, then new edition comes out, and now what? You're gonna snap all the bases off of your terrain?
No. Well, my recommendation, if there's any TOs listening, it's not the most beautiful thing to do, but if you want to put like some painter's tape on your triangle base and just be like, I know this is the base, but the base only begins where the painter's tape is. Painter's tape, so it's not ruining the terrain. Like get
Yeah,
ruined by wall. I had a
or
bad
even
painter's tape
yeah.
experience 2 weeks ago. It was real bad. Um,
Or even if you want to be more aggressive with it, just be like, it only counts if you're touching the wall. If you're not physically touching the wall, then like you're obscured.
yeah,
Um, because yeah, as its infantry have to sit way, way too far back to be relevant. Which is why we're seeing all these like mechanized lists be good. But like, I don't know, what if your Primera Space Marines and your transport's just bad? Well, too bad. Your army's not good now.
Yeah.
Like, what's the good Space Marine army? It's White Scars because they are fast enough to sit behind terrain and get somewhere and do something from behind terrain. And all the other Space Marine armies moving 6 inches just don't. do it. They're just not fast enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Long story short, the community might have come to the decision that you're supposed to be using the bases, but as a TO, empower yourself to be like, I think the game would be better played with if we didn't even count that base there, and just tell your players that, put it on the sheet for the table, just make your terrain better for the player's experience.
And just be 100% clear and explicit what the expectation is. Because nobody wants to like try to figure that out day of at the table.
Yeah.
Even just something simple like, hey, where does the actual footprint of the terrain start? Is it on the interior wall of the building? Is it the exterior wall of the building? Is it the base of the building? Yeah, there's a lot of different interpretations, and I heard all of them at the event, and nobody was wrong. You know, that's the important thing. Nobody was wrong because it wasn't explicitly outlined in the packet.
For sure.
Yep.
And just to chat is pointing out that something that a lot of people get wrong is that obscuring is per model, not per unit, and that's absolutely correct. If you have one dude touching obscuring terrain, that one guy can shoot his gun, everyone else can't, and also he's probably getting his whole squad killed.
Yep.
So yeah, if you want to shoot the terrain, like make sure your whole unit's touching it, because it's only the things that are actually touching it can see through. Which is it's a rule that people are still struggling, because the terrain rules in this edition are weird. They're not super intuitive.
You know, and I spent all of last edition like bitching at GW to be like, please give us terrain rules, and now they gave it to us, and now I don't know what to do with my hands.
I thought I was saying the 9th edition terrain rules are significantly better. It's just Ben and I played a game 2 weeks ago where we actually like set up some terrain, looked at our first turn and be like, oh, this isn't gonna be a game. Let's just like call this thing that was supposed to be dense obscuring this like foot by foot piece of terrain in the middle of the board. Well, this has to be obscuring or we're not playing a game.
Yeah, because whoever goes first is just gonna blow the other person off the table, because it's just like literally the whole army is visible. All right. Shall we talk about building lists, designing lists?
Yeah, so let's talk about it. So like I mentioned at the start of this episode, where RTTs end up being like a pretty good like rapid fire like testing ground for your list concepts, because you're gonna get 3 games in one day against probably a varied amount of competitively minded lists. Like it's great to like practice against like your friends or your team, but there comes a certain amount of familiarity with your opponent's armies and their strategic thinking when this one would shake it up and really like put it through the paces. Like testing against friends and teammates kind of proves out, is a concept viable? And then when you bring it to an RTT, is like, well, is it actually like, does it actually have legs?
Yeah. You learn some basic things like, oh, if I create these aura 4 buffs, my guys feel unstoppable. And then you play the game and you realize, oh yeah, but now my entire army is one blob that can only hold one objective. Thus, I've lost the game.
Ah, yes, 8th edition Thousand Suns.
So like when
Ultramarines.
So I want to pick your guys' brains a little bit. When you're thinking of a totally new list concept, you're not taking a list that you've had before and you're just iterating it after some experience with it. You're wholesale building a new list. Either it's a new list for an army you already have, or a new codex came out and you want to put 3 Vindicators and 3 Land Raiders on the table.
So you'll be interesting to know that Ben and I have similar but different starting parts. Starting points of this.
We both agree on what the first 2 steps are, but we do them in opposite order.
Okay, so
to give you the wrong way of doing it, Kevin's going to go first.
Okay. I was going to say, Kevin, I want to hear it from you first.
Step 1 and step 2 are we just flip them. So, all right, Kevin, what's your
so my step 1? My step 1 is figure out what the meta is. So For instance, in this current meta, we have a bunch of uh, when you look at AdMech kind of bully non-vehicles with their Skitari, and their other vehicles are very efficient. But if you can make their Skitari inefficient, then you're doing good. And then when you're playing against Shukari, um, if you can blow up their raiders and then have um, you need certain types of guns to blow up their raiders, um, and then a lot of DACA to kind of a certain type of DACA to really pick up the witches really efficiently.
Many
Um,
garbage shots as possible.
yeah, it kind of led me to the place where I'm in. Like my current competitive list is an Iron Hands list because I want to be able to like guaranteed pick up like two raiders that I see, and then DACA them down on the first turn. Hopefully the it's weird we were just talking about terrain, but like hopefully there's terrain that I can like see them and shoot them. But likewise, I want my threats to not be something. I want my threats to be able to look at the AdMech threats and be like, okay, I have the super dreadnought that can pick up all your chickens, and then the rest of my threats are vehicles, so your infantry bobs can't harm my dreadnoughts, and that's where I'm at. Which essentially then leads to the second point where now that I've identified what kind of threats, what kind of meta we're in, I kind of already said this, but like, what what faction do I want to play, and what does that faction need to do right now in order to be good? That was my step two. Now
Yeah,
Ben,
I kind of put I kind of combine pick my faction with my step one. Which my step one is like, what is my game plan? How do I plan on winning the game? And there's basically three things I could put here. You know, I have just like murder your opponent off the table. That's either like with shooting, fighting, or psychic powers. Um, be unbelievably durable and just sit on all the objectives and like just get hit and score the points anyway. Or be really tricky, which is actually what most ninth edition lists are doing. Most ninth edition lists are on the like be really tricky. AdMech busted because it does all three. It is simultaneously durable, tricky, and murderous, and it has enough of all of those things to beat. Minus trick, it has like it's not quite tricky enough that it could win games alone on how tricky it is, but it could win games alone on how tanky it is. And it could win games alone on how shooty it is. That's a separate issue. Um, Also in the current ninth edition, I'm finding it less and less interesting to try and be super durable. You can do it. There's like certain profiles that armies are getting worse and worse at picking up as everyone's trying to figure out how to kill AdMech and Dark Galdar. Specifically, those profiles are anything that starts with toughness 8. Um, but for the most part, it's right now we're on like murder the crap out of them or score all the points despite whatever they're doing. Um, and or in some combination of those two. And I think most people have correctly in ninth edition landed on being very flexible and tricky is like the better version of most lists. I tend to agree with them. I do think that's a better version of most lists. I know I'm playing a murder the crap out of them Tau list, but it's only because Tau just doesn't have the tools to be tricky. Um, I'm going to focus on Thousand Suns for the purposes of this discussion from here on out because I think that's the more normal list to talk about. In that it's trying to play ninth edition like all the other armies trying to play ninth edition. And then yeah, from there I do go to Kevin's first step, which is all right, what's the meta? Because what you're trying to do to be tricky, tanky, or murdery depends on what the meta is. Like I don't want to bring 50 las cannons to a fight with 1,000 guardsmen against me. Like that doesn't work. Um,
so
yeah.
it's funny as I was thinking about this, I realized why there's the difference. You don't play Space Marines. I play Space Marines. Space Marines actually have every option. So I needed to identify what the meta is and then build the Space Marine list to go into that meta. Where if I was thinking about like, oh, when I used to play Custodes, I used to have to do the opposite. And it's like, yeah, that's the secrets.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, so I guess first you need to pick your faction. Yeah, all right. That's like the real first step, right? Is like what faction you want to play. So if you're like, I'm going to buy a new army. Okay, well now you can just be like, here's step one, here's step two. If that's what you're doing, great. I would start with my step one, which is what do you want your army to do? Then go to step two, what's the meta, and then pick your army. If you're just like, all right, this is my army, the first thing you have to do is recognize, like, what does your army do? If your army is Tau, you're murdering them because your tricky game is like fine, but it's just not as good as everyone else's.
My piranha dies and then 2 drones come out. That is my trick. Good
Yeah,
luck about it.
you can play like scout movers and things that deep strike that can do actions. It's fine, fine.
Tricky.
And if you're playing Imperial Knights, you're blowing them off the table and you're tanky because you're toughness 8. And which a lot of things struggle to kill, and you have infinite damage. But you're garbage at scoring primary and secondaries because that's just like the nature of that faction right now. So yeah, if you your faction is going to inform a lot of these decisions. So yeah, that's sort of where we go there. All right, Kevin, where do you go from there? All right, we have our plan, we have the meta. What's your next step?
So with our plan, we have to kind of determine what the core of our army is, how many points that takes up, where our flex is. With my Iron Hands list, there's the Super Dreadnought, there's the character who sits by the Super Dreadnought, and then there's, for me, it's the 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts to go with it. And I kind of consider that the core. That's kind of what I've been shifting around through the various Iron Hand iterations, but to me, that's like
Oh,
the core.
so do you feel like that's like particularly strong into the meta?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I agree. My next step in more general terms would be like to find your best tools given what you're trying to do, and think about how much you need to dedicate to them and how much you're willing to dedicate to them. When I say that, I mean that in terms of points, like actual just like how many points are those? Faction traits, like am I okay? So for Iron Hands, like all right, Iron Hands, I'm just playing Iron Hands. That's the one faction trait. Thousand Suns, I'm like, all right, like what sub faction do these guys want to be in? They want to be kind of let's talk about like the Vindicator Hellbrute list I was talking about last week. Um, well, Vindicators and Hellbrutes want to be Cult of Knowledge. Do I want to run my entire army as Cult of Knowledge, or is that a resource I'm spending more command points on to unlock more cults? And then, all speaking of and the resources or command points, all right, what relics do these things need? Are there any relics or warlord traits that I just like must have to run these things? How many are there any strats I'm using every turn on these things? Like, what is my cost on this to to like use my best tools to accomplish the goal I'm trying to do? And sometimes the cost is everything. Sometimes you're like, all right, I'm just like spending 1,600 points and I've allocated like 14 of my 17 command points for this game to my main plan, which means I need to figure all the side things with like 400 points left. And sometimes you're like, all right, like it's just like a dreadnought, but a bunch of command points because there's a bunch of strats you want to use them in every turn. So for my for like the T-Suns list, it's more of a tankiness list. Like I had said, all right, I want a bunch of toughness 7 and 8 models with 5 up and vulnerable saves and piles of wounds, and then psychers. So for me, that the resources, my best tools were rhinos, vindicators, and hellbrutes because those are like the tanky things and the murdery things. And so all right, we definitely need to bring 3 hellbrutes. 3 vindicators would be neat, but it doesn't quite fit for detachment, so I'm just bringing 2. And then rhinos are efficient, but they're sort of our filler. So I'm going to go do everything else and then just fill up the rest of the list with rhinos. And that's how I did that because the rhinos were just like the most efficient tankiness tool after that. And I wanted to get everything else in order before I went back and just like, all right, we're gonna do the rest of the list with rhinos. I kind of said I didn't want to go below 5, but there were other things I wanted to make sure I did first.
Okay.
So it's at this point that you should probably, if you have like a friend you'd be willing to play with, try out that core. See what you like from the core and what you feel like your core is lacking. For me, as I was iterating through Iron Hands, I needed to figure out a secondary that I could get a lot of points on, because the one thing Iron Hands are very weak about is actually like being super good at the primary. They're okay, but I'm very rarely I'm actually very common gonna get like 40 or 35.
Yeah.
Because unless I'm easily just blasting my opponent off the table, I just don't like get on I'm not probably ever getting on like a large amount of objectives. And so I'll probably get the 10 points a few times, and then the 5 points once, and I just kind of have to note that that's where my primary is. So I need a good secondary.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, this is just to call out explicitly. This is my next step in my process, line list process building, which is deciding, am I focusing on primary or secondary? I tend to lean towards secondary because primary like will happen. Secondaries, if you don't think about them, you will just score zeros and it's a disaster. There are armies that would just be like, I'm going to score the primary, and then there are some secondaries that are like, if you're just crushing the primary, you can score them. Um, but that oftentimes looks like you're just pushing your opponent off the table, so nothing really matters at that point. But
so
for me, it's usually look at secondaries and figure out my like minimum is 2 that I can score no matter what my opponent is doing. And I think the best lists are going to just have the 3 secondaries that they can just walk up to the table and be like, I have my secondaries written down without looking at your opponent's list. Obviously, if they're like running 5 knights, take Titan Slayer because they're just giving it to you. But unless they're just handing you a secondary, you should have 3 secondaries. You're like, I can score 10 plus points in all of these. And then think about like, what are the tools that you need to do that? And what are the list building restrictions you put on yourself to do that?
I agree that you can do that to some extent. I at that point like trying to play the game just because sometimes you learn things that just like they felt like they were making sense, but like I give that example again where all of your guys are in one giant aura ball, and it's like, oh yeah, they all feel super point efficient, but I can't score. It's like, okay, we need to take a step back. You also like sit down and you like look through your secondaries, and like this is why in theory you could think through your secondaries first, but like sometimes you think you can do a secondary, and then you go to do that secondary, and you realize I could not do that secondary.
Right.
Um, which,
So like,
by the way,
that's good.
does hit on a very important point. Don't be discouraged if your first version of the list is bad or has flaws in it. Uh, you're only going to get a good list by doing iterations.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So yeah, for Thousand Suns, I went with To the Last. To the Last is a secondary that is sort of like your Blitz can do it or it can't. It's very challenging. It can be a little tricky to figure out if your list is a list that can do it or if it's not a list that can do it. Generally speaking, a list that can do it have expensive characters that sit behind everything else. Although occasionally lists that can do it have extraordinarily expensive things that are very hard to kill that don't quite tend to make their points back if you play Keiji with them, but then become a pain if you need to kill them to get points. So things like Mortarion. Like if you take Mortarion and take To the Last, minus against Sisters, like where they just melted him off the table. If you don't throw him at your opponent on turn 1, and like wait till turn 2 or turn 3 to commit him, then there's like some real things you can do where like, oh, Mortarion all of a sudden just becomes like 5 points because either your opponent is like throwing their army at him to kill him because he is very resilient, or you're going to like score those points. And that's matchup dependent. Mortarion's not the most perfect unit, but like things like that. Most armies for To the Last are just going to be like, To the Last, these 3 characters, they're cheaper than everything else in my army. Either because my army is full of a bunch of cheap units, or those characters are particularly expensive. It's one of the reasons I like the new Thousand Suns Codex so much is you can get sorcerers and demon princes are 185 points, Armin's 180. You can get exalted sorcerers to be 160, and that's just more expensive than all of your vehicles outside of Land Raiders. So you can bring Vindicators, you can bring Hellbrutes, you can bring Rhinos, and your sorcerers are just more expensive than that, and just can stand behind all these vehicles and be like, all right, that's 15 points.
I've already kind of talked about it with Iron Hands, but I went down a similar path where I know I like the Redemptors. I know I had the super character Dreadnought, whose entire point of the super character Dreadnought is that he doesn't die and just continues to output. Okay, how do I get I want another character for To the Last so I can at least get 10 points. This is where we get the dual thunder hammering wielding chapter master, like because that equals a Redemptor Dreadnought, thus it becomes a viable To the Last target. It's funny. My list would get so much worse if they made Chapter Master 5 points cheaper. And
It might happen too.
I know,
Like no one's
I
taking
know.
capture masters, or a real chance it gets cheaper, and that guy just like becomes useless. It's really funny.
Um,
Oh
but
yeah,
this kind of
oh, sorry, go ahead.
for me, this kind of made the third thing I actually had struggled a long time with the third thing, and I was looking at what people were bringing. The Land Raider Achilles um, is a Land Raider with an invuln save. Its guns are very good into Tricari. Um, and because I'm Iron Hands, I wasn't planning on taking the Iron Stone before. When I was initially writing up the list because I was originally very Dreadnought heavy, but I'm like, I can essentially have a Dreadnought Land Raider with the DR1.
Feel good.
DR1 invuln save, 6 up fill no pain, 5 up invuln save, 6 up fill no pain Land Raider. Now we're talking about a very resilient Land Raider.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and that's the other thing with To the Last too, is like if your To the Last targets are two characters and like some tank, that's fine. 10 points on the secondary that you don't need to think about is excellent. So like if that tank's gonna die over the course of the game, like in 90% of your games, like don't even worry about like trying to protect it or playing cagey with it. Like play with it however you need to play with it to do good on everything else. 10 points on a secondary that you did zero effort to score is excellent. It's gonna put you in a really good place.
In our Thousand Suns game, because of Armor of Contempt, there was a moment where I actually just like it was one of my To the Last targets, but I just put it up before to bed and it's like, can you get through 16 wounds right now on my TA model with To the Last? Because if not, I'm gonna walk up and heal it 3 in. I kept cycling which things he was smiting into.
Yep, it's pretty sure.
Yeah.
Um, the And so yeah, then the other thing is just like, all right, are you doing maneuver secondaries? If you're doing maneuver secondaries, are you taking cheap things to do those secondaries? Do you have things that forward deploy? Do you have things that scout move? Do you have things that can deep strike? How expensive are those things? Are you do you um, like you don't really want to be throwing away like suppressor squads on like retrieve Arterius data. You can, but that may not be the best plan. On the other hand, are you like or commandos are like what 55 points for a squad? That's great. They're super good at secondaries. Just throw them out there, retrieve Arterius data, screen stuff out. That's excellent. Um the um oh yeah, chat's asking me if I've given up on scarabs already. I have not given up on scarabs. The issue with scarabs is that they remove your ability to the last super well. Like if you're taking one 10-man squad, you can do the last choose two characters, and that's fine. But I don't want to. I kind of am more interested in taking a bunch of fives, and then all of a sudden, to the last isn't good, and that's kind of a mess.
I was thinking about scarabs like Necron scarabs. I'm like, why are they asking about
Oh
Necron
no,
scarabs?
Scarab Terminators, yes. Which are very good, and are good at other sorts of secondaries. And then like other so there's other things. So this is sort of unique to Thousand Suns, but for 70 points, you can take a Zanger Shaman who's just gonna actually and one command point to give him a warlord trait. And he's just gonna actually max out as like secondary for you every game. It's just free. It's unbelievable how good he is at the psychic secondary. So that's just like if some armies, if you're playing in a meta that lets you do faction secondaries, there's other armies that have things like that where you're like, this one unit's just gonna like do a secondary for me, like Dark Angels, like taking a 5 to 10 man Terminator squad and just being like, you're shooting in my deployment zone. They're kind of impossible to murder, and also 15 points in that Dark Angel secondary that says sit on the objective with some dudes who are obsec.
So
Um,
I just want to note one thing. When we were talking about know the meta, this is knowing if you can take book secondary faction secondaries
for sure.
is something you should be doing in the term of the meta step. If your TO doesn't make it explicit, you can probably assume that the faction ones are in, but it's still probably worth asking.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want to do is show up there as a Dark Angels player and be like, I'm going to hold this objective. It's like, oh, we're not playing with those. It's like, oh.
Yeah, it's a
Why
good,
did I take
easy
these
way to
5
get caught with
Terminators
your
with
pants
Thunder
down.
Shields, Storm Shields, and Thunder Hammers? Like, oops, they don't do anything. Um, the Oh, someone's saying that perhaps he can't take the warlord trait in chat. Oh, that might be true. Even so, he still can do the action because the action most of the psychic actions only go off on like fours. But that is good to know. The
So,
so go ahead.
Chris,
Yeah.
at this point, we've just talked at you for 20 minutes. Uh, what are you thinking?
I mean, I like the overall thought processes that are going into this. I mean, like we've hit all the key points, right? Like, how do when you're thinking of putting your list together, what do you pick first? Do you pick the army that you want to play, or do you pick, what you want that army to be able to do, and then how do you address the the threats that you're going to face, with that list that you're putting together. I think an interesting way, a third way that we're not thinking about is what about the guy that isn't just going on, gamesworkshop.com and thinking, all right, I just listened to these three nerds on 3D6 Charge podcast and they said AdMech is the way to go, so I'm going to drop $3,000 on AdMech. What about the guy that just like really loves like Gene Stealer cults? Like he's been reading their lore since they've been making their lore, and he loves all of their models, and like he bathes in Magos purple contrast paint. You know, what about that guy? What about that guy who like he's got his army, he knows it's not meta, um, but he wants to make it work. Maybe he's like you, Ben, and he's got his version of Tau, and he wants to pivot and try to be like, top 5, top 3, top person in the world, or in like New England or on the West Coast playing Gene Stealers.
So I think that this method works for that. Like you look at your army. All right, I'm playing Gene Stealer cults. I got my three options: murder them, be tanky, be tricky. Gene Stealer cults are tricky. Okay. What secondaries am I going to take? Well, Gene Stealer cults are really good at all of the movement and action secondaries. You're probably taking engage in all fronts. It's a real argument for retrieve Octarius data. Sorry, not engage in all fronts is doable. You're actually probably doing stranglehold in most missions. Um, you're doing things like retrieve Octarius data. You're doing, um, oh goodness, mission secondaries are pretty good for you. Depending on how you build your list, you could probably build a list to do Well We Stands. I
Yeah.
think you're probably more likely to build 20-man blobs, in which case you're not. But those are like a lot. Oh, psychic secondaries. You have a bunch of psychers. They can null deep strike. Like psychic secondaries are like probably reasonable for you. It's a little harder to build your list around that. I think you could build like I think that this all works for that. Like you're going down the list. You just have to recognize what your army is good at. Like you're not trying to be tanky. You think everything's see-through with no armor. You're killing enough. Like you kill things, but your goal probably shouldn't be to table your opponent. Like that, you're just not going to be successful. And I think you can just by just like focusing on what your army is good on, like you can build a reasonable list. Bats like Gene Stealer cults have a really bad win rate for a reason. They're extraordinarily hard to play, and they're like not particularly good even when you're executing perfectly. But like they do the thing.
Yeah.
Just
So I wanted to bring that example up because when we were talking about this topic earlier today, I'm trying to figure out what the hell we're gonna talk about. One of the things that I thought about was like when you go to a tournament, whether it be an RTT, a GT, or major, whatever, and you don't want to go there trying something new for the very first time. Like if you give like this Gene Stealer player like 100 reps, and then you give somebody who's never played AdMech before at a AdMech list, like who's gonna win? I probably bet on the Gene Stealer player because he knows what he can do with that army. So I that's the kind of thing that I would try to emphasize to people trying to put together their lists right now. It may be tempting to go out and drop that money on, on that AdMech, on the Jakari, on, whatever the flavor of the month is. But, it's going to be for naught if you don't get practicing and you truly understand, the philosophy behind the list that you're building and what that list can do. I could throw in a bunch of sports analogies too, but I know Ben hates them. So
Um, yeah, and like you said, like if you know what you're doing GSC, like you practice a bunch, you figure your list out a bunch, like GSC can still do some gross stuff. You're just gonna play circles around people who are chasing the meta.
yeah, is
Especially
it
if
going
you
to be an
just like
uphill
focus
fight?
on
Like,
like
yeah, probably. Don't kid yourself, but there's been plenty of like actual wars where the some one side's had an uphill fight and they've won.
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like all GSE needs to do is get some of their old point costs back. Because it they're in a lot of ways they're kind of just Drakari but less points efficient. I actually don't think they're I just think their stuff's overcosted. I think if you
Mhm.
like I don't know.
I
I
agree.
think yeah.
They're just overcosted right now. Everything they do, like, all right, what do you want to do in ninth edition? I want to have a million throwaway units that don't cost like that are MSU and function well at MSU that have good ways of defending themselves before they're doing a thing. So deep striking the whole army. It's pretty good. Um, I want to have a reasonable ability to survive if I go second. So, my opponent not being able to come within charge distance when they go first, and also me being able to decide where every model is after they move. Pretty good. Um, I want to have the ability to score a bunch of secondaries really well. Okay, well, what if everything deep strike? They're all like 5-man squads. I want the ability to steal objectives out from other people. I can deep strike object things 3 inches away from you. Like they just kind of do all the things that you want. Their points are just egregiously bad, and so you just run out of resources too soon. But if you can conserve your resources, you can do things. All right, but back to general list designing because I know we've been talking about GC for a little bit now. So we're on first thing, faction. Second thing, we disagree with, but it's going to be either what does your army do or what's the meta, and then flip flop that for the third thing. Then we're on, all right, what secondaries are you trying to score? If your opponent's like, all right, I'm playing Custodes, I offer you nothing. Like, what are the secondaries you're taking? Um, and then after that, we're on to sorry, I apologize. We said then what tools do you want? Then we're doing secondaries, and yeah, and then after that, what are you looking at now?
I think I
See,
think
this is
I think the
but
next point might be like, how do you deal with different deployment types? I mean, that goes hand in hand now with like different missions. It's not randomized deployment, but like still, like have a plan for what happens if you're deploying uh, long ways. What happens if you're deploying short ways? What if it's
Mhm.
the bullshit Vanguard strike one? Um, that one's
I
actually
think
not bullshit. It's just a pain in the ass to measure out.
so yeah, I think that's probably about where I'm going to is like what's the footprint of your army look like when I'm deploying my army onto the table now because we're getting closer to like actually playing the game. What does my footprint look like on the average terrain? And goes back to like what's the meta? Like what's the literal local meta for your terrain? Like what does terrain look like on tables? So with some of my earlier T Sims lists, I was like, all right, my entire army fits in 2 rhinos. Like just like everything's gonna be either deep struck or in these 2 rhinos. Like I'm just literally hiding everything. Ta-da. Um, and like so you could do something like that. You could do things like, all right, like what do I need to hide? What do I not care if it dies? And just start thinking about like where can things go if I go first, if I go second, what's this look like? How good am I at reaching across the table? Some deployment zones are just like further away from your opponent than others. Some of them are really deep. So if your opponent doesn't want to be close to you, they can deploy really far back if you're a melee army. Um, and start thinking about how your army functions on the table when it is both close and far from your opponent and the objectives.
And I think something that goes like right next to this, like immediately after, is are you, what happens if you go first or second? You don't get to pick anymore. Whoever wins is going first.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. Yeah, so think about like where your balls have to be if you're going second, where they have to be if you're going first. Are those two things the same thing? If you don't have a redeploy, figure out how to make them the same thing.
yeah.
Um, and then sort of winding down here, part of this too is like if you can include cheap Gribbly throwaway units, like definitely think about that. Like a single Chaos Spawn could do a lot for just zoning out Deep Strike, and like it has a 18-inch pie plate around itself of like no Deep Strike here. That's a really big area your opponent can't go for 23 points. So even if you're like this, your army's just this ball of efficient monsters. If you can fit in like Gribblies or like whatever silly cheap lore unit your army has, like so many armies have things like Crusader squads, like 2 Crusaders, 2 Death Cult Assassins, a Chaos Spawn, Servitors, command squads for Astra Militarum, like just like random, like lore driven, like 2-man squads that don't really do anything that are super cheap. Like they just do a lot for pushing out objectives. And sometimes if they're infantry, they can do an action. I wouldn't rely on them for that, but like it happens. I like to bring about 50 to 80 points of those in most lists. Like I think like a couple Chaos Spawn is like pretty good in most Sun's lists. I currently have one. The list I have right now on my phone is like this is the list I'm painting to, has 1 Chaos Spawn in it because I think it just does enough that you just like want a Gribbly.
Yeah, for your like you want to spend like 25, 50 points on that kind of thing. I know for like my my lists, you know, as a chaos player, I'm either generally speaking bringing a 1 or 2 chaos spawn, or for whatever I decide not to bring chaos spawn, I'll set aside like 45 points to summon in a unit of chaos furies.
Yeah, perfect. Those are great. I tend, yeah, because there's not a ton of first turn deep striking except for AdMech, which makes me a little bit more interested in having my cheap throwaway unit be something that can like start on the table, because that way you can like be like, all right, if my opponent goes first and they solar flare me, like I actually can just like put a place where they can't be.
Yeah,
And
that's the reason why I switched to using spawn instead of furies, because if I go second, I'm screwed.
Because like 2 chaos spawn in a building can basically keep the solar flare unit off of whatever infantry unit you're trying to hide in a building. Chat's pointing out crypto thralls for Necrons. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. 40 points, 2 dudes, infantry. They can screen stuff out. They can do actions. They're doing all the things. My last big thing for lists, and this is something that I think I probably value more than other people, and which means I'm probably in the wrong, is like the defensive profile of my list, and more accurately homogenizing the defensive profile of my list. I think that if your list goes, and this is one of the reasons that Dark Eldar is so good. If your list goes, all right, here's this defensive profile. I hope your guns are good against it, because it's literally the only one I have. So think about Dark Eldar, right? Like, all right, you're going first against Dark Eldar. You look across the table. What are you shooting at?
1
Raiders.
All right,
of 6.
Cool. So every single thing is toughness 6, 4 up armor, 5 up invulnerable save, with the option to be -1 to be hit. That's it. There's nothing else on the table. Everything is in a Raider or off the table. Maybe there's some like 4 deployed dudes behind a building that you can't see. And they just bring a ton of that profile. Once you crack the Raider, everything is toughness 3 with a 6 up invulnerable save. Sometimes it has a reasonable armor save. They basically have 2 defensive profiles in the entire army. And that's one of the things that makes them so good. That's one of the reasons that we're seeing the stupid Volkite guns everywhere. Volkite's like this really bizarre profile that just happens to be good against both of their Eldar defensive profiles. Strength 6, no AP, 2 damage. Well, they have crap armor saves. They're all T3 or T6. So you're rooting on 4s or 2s. Like strength 6 is the break point for both of those toughnesses. No AP is the correct amount of AP when everything pretty much just has invulnerable saves. The first point of AP matters against them. The second point doesn't. That's why you see Volkites everywhere. They're also good against AdMech because 2 damage means they don't get +1s on saves for being Lucius. It also means that their Pains are worse when they have those from the new Skitari cohort thing. And then sometimes the mortal wounds matter when they make themselves have when they give themselves the super defensive profiles. So my 1,000 Suns list, everything is a Rhino or a Vindicator, or Helder. It's all toughness 7. It all has 3 up armor, except the things that are toughness 8. They all have 5 up invulnerable saves. That's the profile. Your anti-infantry guns are garbage against me. And some armies can do this, some armies can't. Most armies tend to be the other way on mine, where they just be like, all right, everything's out on the table. I'm not bringing tanks. Like, let's go back to Genius Killer Cults. Your Genius Killer Cults army Every single guy is toughness 3 with a 5 of armor save, period. That's it. Your bolters and las guns are great. I hope you didn't spend too many points in dark lances and blasters. They're actual garbage against me.
I think one of the things about how that can be said about having a single defensive profile too is that it makes your opponent I want to say like have to like think about shooting a little bit more, because like when you have a laser cannon and you have your two targets are a guardsman and a Lehman Russ, like one of those targets is obvious. You're gonna shoot the laser cannon at the Lehman Russ. But if everything's a chimera, well, doesn't matter if it's a heavy bolter or a laser gun or a laser cannon, you just shoot at something. But then it's going to be like, all right, well, which one do I shoot first? Do I shoot the laser cannon first, and then hopefully I can do some chip damage with like an auto cannon later? And it makes them do like a little bit of mental math, which might trip them up. I don't know. It probably won't, but like the possibility exists.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of guard lists move towards chimeras, because everything's bringing Volkites hunting those toughness 3 Eldar. Well, if you put everything in a toughness 7 vehicle, all of a sudden, all this anti-Eldar firepower that has enough AP, it's like pretty crappy against your 3 up armor save vehicles. Kevin, where are you on the homogenize your defensive profiles? How do you feel about that? Yay or nay?
Yay. Okay. Part of the thing sometimes that's kind of the thing that ended up happening with the Iron Hands list is I had some things that I felt like I could keep very far back. I ended up adding suppressors, but suppressors can actually play very far back and not engage. And then at one point in the list, I had intercessors, and then I realized like intercessors, like that extra 30 points, I'm not really getting anything because I put them in any place important. My opponent's anti-intercessor guns are just going to pick it up. I just want to go as cheap as possible in my cheap choice. So tack brains, and they actually feel great in Iron Hands because their entire point is just to stand somewhere and die. And sometimes they're harder to die than you think.
Yeah, and there is a cost to this, though, right? It's not free just to be like, oh, my entire army is going to be the same defensive profile. So going to my Thousand Suns list, someone asked me, I given up on Scarab Cults. Well, this is one of the reasons I'm not really on Scarab Cults. They're toughness 4. They just like turn on guns that all my tanks turn off. Like reasonable AP strength 4 guns are not particularly good against rhinos, and they're very good against Scarab Cult Terminators. And I'm just like, what if I just like don't put the Scarab Cults on the table? Well, now those guns are just like actually turned off. The real cost for me though, I felt like is Rubric Marines. Like I do want OBSEC. And having I at one point was on 1 squad of Rubric Marines, and that felt like way too low, so I'm up to 2. Because you could stick them in rhinos, they fall out when the rhino dies. Just get OBSEC on points. And I do need to do more testing with this list to like figure out if I can get away with that little OBSEC. So it's not free. Just be like, all right, my whole army is going to be this thing. For most armies, it is. For some Custodes, it's free. Everything gets to be 2 up armor and 4 up invulnerable save, because that's just like the army's identity. That's one of the things that makes them kind of interesting right now. Is not only are they homogenized on the defensive profile, they're homogenized on a defensive profile that is wildly different than the best armies in the game. Like the guns that are good against Admech and Chikari are just like really sad against Custodes. Like Volkites are a joke against them. They don't do anything.
Yeah, that's part of the reasons why I've liked the Iron Hands, like in regards to the troop choices. Just turns out that like Volkite 2 damage shots, like when you have a 6 up photo pain, just like does not kill as many things as you want. It really doesn't.
For sure. And I think and then after that is just putting it on the table, practicing, iterating. And it'll become obvious, is it like, oh, this was close? Or is it just like, all right, this is garbage, throw it away, start over. Sometimes you're like, all right, the core was strong. So like, let's start out like our thousands on this game. And sometimes you need to test like a wildly skewed version of your list where you're like, I know this list isn't good, but it needs to answer a question. So for Kevin and I tested Thousand Suns, I looked at Ruby Greens and I said, I don't think these are great, but I want to answer the question, how good are they? So I just put 30 of them on the table. And they felt fine. I was like, all right, what do they land Ruby Greens? I'm not embarrassed to play them. I'm not particularly excited to play more than like the minimum number I need to fill out my detachments. Maybe a couple more for some upsec. And so now I have like a list where I liked how the rhinos felt, so I've gone way up on the number of rhinos I'm playing, way up on the number of tank bodies I'm playing, because turns out 5 of them learnable saves are really stupid. And I'm now looking to play some games with that list before I iterate it on it some more. And I don't really plan on changing it significantly every time I play, because I think I've gotten to a list that's like pretty good, and I don't want to wildly change it every time I play, because I don't want to throw out something that's good that was just like bad in a single matchup that I just need to test some more.
Oh yeah, that is a big part of iteration. Make sure you're not like over skewing to the list here. Overreacting to a loss. You really gotta like look and like, did I lose to something that would normally happen? Like for instance, if you go up Custodes is a great example. If you go up against Custodes and just feel like you couldn't damage any of their things, well, maybe you just have a really bad Custodes matchup. And if you play against 3 other matchups, like for somehow you find the miracle list that's good against Admech and Drakari, but you lose to Custodes, I'd play that list. Because I'd run the gambit that I never play against Custodes, then I don't play against those two.
Yeah, I mean, it's also important, I think,
unless you
to
play Massachusetts, where everyone play Custodes, and I haven't seen a Dark Elder Admech list up there. That's not true. I saw one Admech list, but there were like 5 Custodies players at our 20-man event. Everyone was playing Custodies.
Yeah, that was kind of nuts.
But if you play down in Connecticut, it's all Admech and Drakari. So yeah, bring that list.
Also, tell me it.
Yeah, also let me know what the list is, because I'd like to purchase one, please.
I think another important thing for your practice reps too is like being able to recognize when things are like just statistically like out of whack. Like, you know, it's a dice game. Like your unit just might fail every fucking save. That doesn't mean that the unit's bad, or even like you may have just made like a strategic error. Doesn't mean that the unit's bad. You know, you got to be able to separate the unit from your decision and from the dice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so just to give an example, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was actually going to give an example. I saw a 5-man Eradicator squad shoot into 1 Redemptor Dreadnought. They came in from Deep Strike. It was Salamanders too, and they failed to kill the Redemptor Dreadnought. And I'm like, the math says by a significant margin, the Redemptor Dreadnought is supposed to be gone right now.
I believe it's supposed to die twice. Like, it's not close.
Yeah. And it didn't. And the answer isn't, well, Eradicators are bad because they can't kill anything. It's like you kind of have to accept the dice are not there. That being said, a valid takeaway might be Eradicators can be skewier than I want them to be.
How can you mitigate that?
How do I mitigate that? And that's a valid takeaway. But if everyone's singing the praise of Salamander Eradicators and you're saying they're not good, it might be you who aren't utilizing them correctly.
I was going to give an example of not overcorrecting. So I lost to Kevin's Iron Hands list in our Thousand Suns vs Iron Hands matchup. Shocking, I know. He's been playing Iron Hands for years, and Thousand Suns have been playing for 1 game. But the overcorrection definitely would have been like looking at like, all right, I'm just going to bring like 3 Land Raiders and 3 Vindicators and 3 Hellbrutes and bring like 6 Melta Guns and 20 Lascans. So just like kill all the vehicles. And that list has the defensive profiles I want. Like everything's T7, T8, 5 of vulnerable saves, 3 of armor. That's great. That list does not have the offensive profiles I actually want into the meta. Like I'm not killing Drakari and Admech units with those profiles. So the list I actually want to be running, I like the Vindicators. They're great for defensive profiles. Land Raiders are good at shooting, but for defense, I'd rather have more wounds because they're not actually particularly efficient for like points to wounds. And it turns out I'd rather just have a bunch of rhinos with double storm bolters on them because that is killing the things I want to kill. That's just a bunch of bolter shots. Every rhino is 30 points cheaper than a Rear Green squad with the exact same firepower. And that's excellent. They just actually has the firepower for Rear Greens, because the squad leader's got a little pistol, functionally the same as the squad. So that was, and I did write that list. I wrote the list on my phone. I'm like, oh, this list is great. And I like stopped for a second. I was like, no, hang on. So this is good against Iron Hands. So this is not actually good against like, if I'm playing against Dark Elder, I'm gonna kill every Raider on the first turn and then just die to all the guys who get out. Like I'm just, or not die, right? They're not gonna kill anything, but they're just gonna score all the points. They're just gonna stand on objectives and be like, 22 las cannons kills one witch squad. All right. Like that's not good math. So yeah, that's just sort of what we're talking about when we're saying like don't overcorrect.
Any other points that we want to hit on? Wrap this up.
Yes, one point I think that I want to hit on is if you're building a new codex, which is oftentimes when you're building a new list, because you're playing an old codex, you've probably been playing it for a while, you've probably iterated on it, you probably have a list you like. If something in it seems so heinously broken it can't possibly be true, don't build around it because it will eventually get FAQ'd. It might be many months because my goodness, GW is just dragging their feet on some nonsense. But you're not doing yourself any favors by practicing with something that's obviously going to go away. And actually, even myself for Thousand Suns, I'm like a little bit back and forth. Like maybe they're just going to take the invulnerable save away from vehicles because that feels weird. Like that they gave it that feels really strong, but it doesn't feel broken. Like Chaos vehicles are not good. They don't feel good at their current point costs. So it doesn't feel broken that they're throwing the invulnerable save on them. They just feel strong. I'm talking about like egregious broken nonsense. Like a lot of work players have pointed out that currently, if Makari is sitting next to Gaz, you can Grot Shields Gaz with Makari, but then they're both untargetable because you have to kill the Grots near Gaz before you can shoot at Gaz. But the Grot is Makari, who's a character who's getting character protection from Gaz. It's like that's obviously not intentional. That is going to get FAQ'd, so Makari can't be used with it. But it's probably going to be a little bit before we see it go away because GW is like actually dragging their feet. And I think you're not doing a service to yourself by practicing with that. And I think you're also kind of just hurting the community because I know that a lot of the events I play in and run, I'm just like, I have a FAQ that just says like, you can't do that because it's nonsense. And I'm sure as I play Thousand Suns, I will find things in there that are just like, all right, this like, is this supposed to be in there? Like, who knows? And like, and we'll just need like an FAQ, just be like, all right, like, no, stop.
So what you're telling me is Swigosaurus need to go down another 20 points.
Sure.
Yes.
So things like that, things are heinously points efficient. Like, yeah, they're gonna be heinously points efficient for a while. Go nuts, play with them, abuse them. Talking about like rules and tractions are just like clearly like this isn't intentional.
So I know the Rob the orc player that I went with, anytime Ben comments that the Squigosaurus is too good, he says it has to go down 20 points, or mentions anything about orcs that is too good. Squigosaurus need to go down another 20 points. At least 20. Thank you, Rob.
It's at least 20. It should be 80 points each, obviously. Like, basically, they should be the same point cost as a succubus, because why wouldn't they be?
Yep. Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Before we sign off, I believe we're at that point. Is Rob our first full year subscriber? I see the announcements on the.
I think so. Yes.
It'd be really awkward if he's not, but I also think so.
Thank you, Rob, for subscribing for a full year.
Thank you for the monies.
Thanks, Rob.
I have yet to get a Twitch payout, but it's one day. Someday Twitch will release the funds, and I will be able to buy our microphone for people. The question is, who do I buy a microphone for first?
Can I buy a camera so that I don't have to like turn my thing everywhere? Turn my computer sideways so it doesn't hit the light.
Oh, dude, do you want me to just send you one? Here's one that's just hanging up on top of my. monitor right now that I don't
He's-
use. I have an actual DSLR that I can use as a camera and that I have used as a camera. Like
Chris is drowning in cameras, and I'm here just stuck with my integrated one.
All right. Well, that being said, either of you guys have anything to add to our conversation on camera related, please, before we hop off?
Kevin, just send me your address. I'll just mail this goddamn camera.
On camera related, Chris, follow the directions. All right. I'm going to assume that means no. Thanks for listening to us talk about how we design lists and our sort of processes for that. Also, congrats to Omar, our ex-host, for getting fourth at the RTT that Chris and I attended. He was just barely missed top 3. And other than that, that is all I have to say before we sign off.
Should have been third, but that's a topic for another day. The short version of that story is chess clocks, but I will digress. Thank you everybody for listening to this week's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, streaming live on Twitch every Monday night, and if you don't get it, the VOD's up on YouTube and the audio's up on the Audiosphere or wherever it goes. Yeah, we'll be back next week. Well, sure, I'll figure out that topic 20 minutes before showtime, and hopefully Kevin will have a new camera. Thanks for listening, everybody, and don't roll any ones.
Drowning in cameras.